Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. We're still traveling with Paul towards Rome. He has left Jerusalem and he is now in Caesarea, and he has been there for 2 years as literally a house prisoner to Felix, and he met with Felix very often, but Felix was so indecisive in his spiritual life, but he was also indecisive in his political life, so that at the end of 2 years, somewhere during that 2 years, there was a riot, and Felix mishandled it tremendously bad, and Rome removed him, and in his place they sent Festus. Now it says this, verse 27 of chapter 24 of Acts says this: but after 2 years, Porcius Festus came onto Felix's place, into Felix's place. In other words, he took his governorship. And Felix, willing to show the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. So Felix, literally, when you say left Paul bound, literally what he's doing is he's leaving the whole mess over to Festus. Now Festus is a man who wants to get things done, and he certainly wants to impress Rome, because governors of Caesarea and governors of Judea have just failed miserably when dealing with the Jews. And chapter 25, verse 1 says this: now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now here is a man who wants to take care of problems. In other words, he goes into the province, and his first thing was to clean up Felix's mess. And the mess is looking him in the face. It's right there in his own house. And that is Paul. So he's going up to Jerusalem to take care of this problem. It says this: then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him. Now, let's go. We can go through the laws. The things that he was being accused of will appear later, and we'll take that up, and that's in Paul's defense. But the chief priest told Festus what he had done, and desired a favor against him. Now, notice what he's doing. He's not pulling the law. He's not looking at this from a legal standpoint. He wants a favor from Festus. And he expects Festus, just like every other governor, he expects him to give him that favor, because it was a natural, I should say, something that existed, that the Jews always somehow manipulated the governors and got them to do their bidding, even when they didn't want to. And probably the greatest example of that is how they handled Pontius Pilate. Now, he desired his favor, and the favor he desired was that he, Festus rather, would send Paul to Jerusalem, would send him to Jerusalem. Now, what Festus did not know, but probably suspected, was that the Jews were laying an ambush so that Paul would never reach Jerusalem. They would kill Paul on the way to Jerusalem. So he suspected that is what would happen. Now, he suspected this because he knew how Festus got Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea. And that was the captain of the Roman army, brought him to halfway because they suspected that there would be an ambush. And therefore, knowing how the Jews and the mind of the Jews are, not just towards Paul, but just how they rule generally, etc., everything was suspected. In other words, it was not, I'll take you at face value. Everything was on guard. Everything was suspected. They suspected the Jews because the Jews just did not keep their word. So now he's being asked to send Paul to Jerusalem, and he suspects that there will be an ambush. So he's not going to do this. And the other thing that he is twisted with is, remember, he's a Roman governor, and therefore he's going to try to keep the law, and keeping the law, and keeping justice, and enforcing justice, even though it was severe, was prime to them. And they even paraded that in their parades. It says this, and the end of verse 3 says this, laying wait in the way to kill him. In other words, the chief priest was asking Festus for a favor to send Paul up to Jerusalem, where they would take care of trying him and take care of this situation, clean up this situation. In other words, they would kill Paul. Only thing is, he would never make it to Jerusalem. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept in Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly for there. In other words, he says, no, I'm going to keep Paul in Caesarea, because obviously Paul is a Roman, and therefore I'm going to keep him there, and I'm going to go back there in just a moment. And he says this, let them, therefore, said he, who among you are able, go down with me. In other words, why don't you, who are able to go and able to travel, come with me, and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. In other words, let's go to Caesarea, and you can come, and you can bring your accusations with you. Now here's a funny thing. What happened with Felix? Didn't they go down to Caesarea? Didn't they lay their accusations before him? So isn't that all on record? And the answer is sure it is. But I think Festus, knowing how Felix ran things and knowing how Felix operated, etc., probably could not trust the records that were there. Maybe the records had been manipulated, we don't know. But for some reason, Festus didn't think that the previous records, the previous trial, had any validity at all. So he ignored it completely. And then he says this, if you come down, you can accuse this fellow. And when he had tarried among them for more than 10 days, so he literally stayed around in Jerusalem for 10 days, and then he went down to Caesarea, and we know the concept between traveling up to Jerusalem, down to Caesarea. Even though Caesarea is north of Jerusalem, it is an elevation down. So they're traveling from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, and as we read the scriptures, there isn't much in the traveling area that we use today, north, east, south, west. They didn't have that. They had it up or they had it down, depending on the elevation. And therefore, they were traveling down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, they commanded Paul to be brought. So now, here is Festus, sitting on the judgment seat. And you will note, if you've seen a picture of Christ standing before his judgment seat, before his crucifixion, after he had been whipped, you would see basically the same kind of situation. The judge, etc., is on a higher level than the accused. The accused is down on a lower level, and therefore the accused must speak up. And that is literally typical of a lot of courts, even courts today, where judges will be elevated to some degree, so that not just so that everybody can see them, but to show them that the highest thing in this court, the most important thing in this court, is the law, and therefore it is the person who can enforce the law. And therefore you would see that this picture I have on the PowerPoint is probably quite exact as far as the physical bounds or physical attributes of this court is. Paul would be looking up to Festus. I have other pictures where Paul is looking almost on an equal plane, but I don't think if it's called a judgment seat, as it is here. Commanded Paul, as it says, sitting on the judgment seat, that was particular to the Romans. They elevated the judge above the accused, so the accused were on a much lower level. It wasn't for protection or anything, it was just to indicate who was in authority. And when he was come, the Jews who came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. In other words, accusations that were thrown at Paul by the priest could not be proved, and therefore they were probably made up. But if we look at the accusations, and we will, when Paul answers, the first accusation was treason against Rome. Now, when you're talking about treason against Rome, in Paul's case, you're not talking about uprising, or you're not talking about taking arms against Rome. What you are doing is you are attacking a particular philosophy or a particular belief system. And the system that they're accusing him of is Paul is preaching a new king. He's preaching Jesus Christ as king. And we know from the scriptures, etc., that Jesus Christ is the King of Kings. But Paul is preaching him as king, and therefore, by getting people to worship Christ, they're really taking the worship of Caesar away from Rome. And he's undermining the Roman government and the Roman religion. And therefore, they call this sedition. But listen, if you listen very closely at the way they're arguing, they're arguing a religious point. Who to worship. And they're accusing Paul of undermining the Roman law of worshiping Caesar. But Paul isn't undermining that at all. What he's doing is he's saying worship Christ. And you can do whatever you want with Caesar. Just worship Christ. And therefore, you begin to see that Festus is sitting on there and he's saying, wait a minute, you're just dealing with a religious issue here. You're not dealing with treason. And the second point, and Paul brings it up, he says he answered for himself, neither against the law, neither against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything. And if you look at this, it says this sectarianism. When he says against the Jews, he says neither against the temple or against Caesar or against the law of the Jews. They accused him of sectarianism. In other words, when he was speaking and bringing in this new religion, etc., he was really undermining the Jewish religion. And in this country, we have a hard time with that because we have this philosophy and this belief that we must keep government separate from church, separate from religion. And therefore we have this great divide. But you have to understand that during this period of time, the Jewish government and the Jewish religion are the same thing. The Jewish customs are so embedded with the New Old Testament, or their view of the Old Testament, and including the temple worship and all this stuff, and the holy days that they had to keep, etc., those feast days, where you could not separate the scriptures, you could not separate the religion from the custom or from the culture. So therefore, if you spoke against the religion, or if you injected something into that was different than what was already in existence, you were speaking against Jewish people. And therefore there was absolutely no separation at all. And if there was any separation from the Jewish religion, it was those who were thrown out or outcast, or they were removed. So they're accusing Paul of doing this, and the last thing they were accusing Paul of doing was sacrilegious, to profane the temple or to speak against God. And he says that here. He says neither against the temple, and that would literally, Paul was saying that now that Jesus Christ has come and made the final sacrifice, there is no need for sacrifices anymore. Is there a need for a temple? Sure. You could have a place to pray, a place to meet and preach and teach. You could use a temple for a lot of reasons, but you could not use a temple for sacrifices, because the sacrifice, the final and ultimate sacrifice, had already been made, and there was no more to come. And therefore, when Paul spoke about that, he was speaking that way, and they considered that speaking against the temple. Now, if you look at this, each one of these has an element of religion. Now, here is a Roman governor who is to rule on a man who is accused of a crime, and the crime he is accused of has nothing to do with a civil matter. There is no civil disorder, civil crime, or disobedience. There is no crime, etc., that the Roman laws would apply to. The only thing that he's being accused of here is violating Jewish religious laws, the various laws of religion. And therefore, Festus doesn't see any reason not to release Paul. He doesn't see anything in his jurisdiction that would warrant a further trial. In other words, you are bringing nothing to me that I can judge on. In other words, it's like saying Festus has no jurisdiction here, and he understands it. And you begin to see it. But Paul, willing to do the Jews a favor, Festus, willing to do the Jews a favor. Now, he wanted to do the Jews a favor. He wanted to stay in good with the Jews. And the reason for that is, if you look at his predecessor, Felix, you see Felix could not control the Jews. And Felix was very brutal with the Jews. And therefore, it just created more strife for Rome. And Rome removed Felix, and Festus did not want that to happen to him. So if he could get in good with the Jews, then the Jews would get along with him. So now, for this, he says this, he was willing to do the Jews a favor. Now, what is it that we have? Here's what he's going to do. He's going to exercise expediency. In other words, at this point in the trial, listening to the short statement by Paul, listening to all the accusations by the Jewish Sanhedrin, the high priest, there's nothing to accuse Paul of. There is nothing to hold Paul. There is nothing Rome has any jurisdiction over. This is a religious matter. You leave it to the religious people. And therefore, he wants to do them a favor, so he's going to, for expediency's sake, he's going to sacrifice justice, because at this point, Festus knows Paul is not guilty of anything that the accusations. And the Holy Spirit is clever enough to tell you in verse 7, he says, which they could not prove. Now here is two unsaved groups speaking against Paul, God's anointed, and they could not prove their accusations. And both parties knew it. The party that was lying knew it. The party that was listening, Festus, knew it. So at this point, justice would have been to release Paul. But for political sake, for do the Jews a favor, they would do him a favor. In return, he makes a deal. And here's what he offers. Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? In other words, he looked at Paul and he says, shall we move this trial to Jerusalem, and there you'll be judged? And Paul knew what would happen. And Paul is going to literally, and this is important, Paul is going to literally force them to do right. Now, I want to stop here, and I want to go back. There is something that is very important, and we need to learn it, and we need to know it. The Jews hated Paul. They hated him. The Sanhedrin hated him with a passion. They wanted him dead. And they were willing to commit murder to do it. They were willing to bypass justice. They were willing to bypass the law and ambush him and kill him. Now, what is frightening about this is, how long have they waited? They've waited 2 years. They've waited over 2 years to get him. And after 2 years, they're just as angry as they were before. In other words, they had time to reason and debate among themselves. Come on, what are we doing? It didn't work that way. It just festered. And this is the picture of sin. It's a picture of how sin can control people. And therefore, when Jesus Christ saves us, He gives us the Holy Spirit. And that Holy Spirit aids us in conquering our sin, to give us victory over the control of sin, and so that sin doesn't control us anymore. In other words, we may occasionally sin, and certainly every believer does, but we don't habitually sin. We aren't caught up in a sin, etc., that captures us and holds us and literally becomes our master. And this did. This hatred for Paul, this desire to kill him, etc., blinded them. Their hatred was blinding. And it was so much so that it literally controlled them for 2 years, so that at the end of 2 years they were just as angry and bitter and hateful, hating Paul, as they were before. Which is a picture of how sin controls it. And now we're here, and Paul is fed up with this. I believe Paul understands this. And he understands how if you don't correct this, if you don't force these people to do right, they will continue to do wrong. And this is an issue that has been posed to Christians for years. For example, if a man sprays paint your house with pornography or with graffiti of some kind, etc., and he does it just because he wants to, just because your house is inviting and he's an evil person. He doesn't know who lives in the house. He doesn't know you are a Christian. So he's committing this crime against you, not knowing who you are. So you can't say, well, I'm suffering for the cause of Christ. You can't say that. So the question then is, can you take this man to court? Or should you silently accept the suffering for Christ? And the answer is, you take this man to court. You take this man to court because you use his laws to force him to do right. In other words, you cannot just dismiss his wrongdoing, because he will never know he does wrong. And the only way an unsaved person knows he's done wrong is if he's faced with the consequence of his wrongdoing. Then all of a sudden he is sorry. He wish he hadn't done it, because now he's caught. He's not sorry that he did it. He's more sorry that he got caught. And therefore, there must be an avenue for a righteous man to force the evil man to do the right thing. And the avenue God has set up, and we find this in Romans chapter 13, he has set up a government to force evil men to do right. And therefore, you must do this. I see this particular scenario in this passage that we're going to read in just a minute. Paul is fed up with this. 2 years of these governors not doing the right thing. Everything they did was for expediency's sake. And now he's fed up. And you really can't blame him. And because Jesus has told him he was going to be get to Rome, etc. He wants to get to Rome. And then Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. In other words, I'm a Roman citizen. I ought to be judged. And therefore, he says this, where I ought to be judged, to the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou well knowest. And then he says this, for if I be an offender, or I have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. In other words, if I'm guilty of anything that deserves for me to die, I'll pay the punishment, I'll die. In other words, if I have committed any crime, I'm willing to pay the price for committing that crime. But he hasn't. Basically, that's what he's saying. And then he says this, but, he says, if there be none of these things of which these accuse me, in other words, they can't prove what no man may deliver me unto them. In other words, there is no person, and he's looking at Festus, neither you can deliver them to me, because let's face it, if you deliver an innocent man to the Jews to be killed, then Rome is going to literally come down on you, and he knows it. And Festus knows this also. He says, I appeal unto Caesar. In other words, Paul says, I am imposing my right, and therefore I am forcing you to do right. And I think this is where Paul is applying that principle. How do you make wicked and evil men do right? You use the law against them. You use the law not to benefit yourself, but to force them to do what they should be doing. And therefore, since Felix didn't do it, Festus is trying to put off to keep a favor with the Jews so he stays in good, and therefore his reign will be a little easier, is ignoring justice. They both ignored justice. Now Paul is forcing them to do justice, to address it. Now he's forcing them to do and obey the law. Then it says this. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, "Have you appealed unto Caesar?" And I would imagine at this point, when he asks this question, there seems to be no answer from Paul. And therefore, when we see no answer from Paul, we begin to think that maybe Paul just nodded. There was just some kind of action of nodding, etc. And he says, okay, there's a pause there. And he says, all right, on to Caesar, shall thou go? And that's where I'm going to send you. And I'm sure at this point, it doesn't reflect it, but I'm sure the Sanhedrin realized they had lost any hopes of killing Paul. In other words, their accusations, etc., were going to go by the wayside, because if Felix wouldn't handle it, Festus wouldn't handle their cause, etc., Rome would certainly not handle their cause. And therefore, their last appeal to an attempt to kill Paul, gone by the wayside. Now, let's stop and look at this. From the time Paul was arrested in the temple, to the time he stands here and he's going to leave Caesarea, and he's going to head, eventually he's going to head for Rome. What do you see? You see the providence of God. Even with Paul trying to help things along, it could not stop God's hand. Even with the Sanhedrin planning ambushes and bringing false accusations, could not stop the plan of God. Even with Felix, who wanted money, etc., a little bribe in order to release Paul, and then Festus, who wanted to do the Jews a favor in order to stay good with the Jews, etc., even they could not stem God's hand, or the providence of God. In other words, what we have is we have God in control, even though God is not mentioned here. And therefore, Paul was told by Christ that he would go to Rome, and therefore, regardless of what happened, that's where he would go. God would make sure that everything turned so that Paul would go to Rome. And now Festus has declared that Paul will go to Rome. I'm going to stop there, and we will continue with that, because Paul is not going to leave Caesarea just yet. We're going to take it up next week. So until then, I wish you Godspeed from on Victory's side. We'll see you next week.